This is Invasions, Volume 1, 350 to 650 AD. This is a Philip Thibault game. I had to buy it for that reason alone. He's designed two games that kind of were defining games for a period of my life, ranging from like 95 or so until say 2005, somewhere in that range. And those two were I have a lot of Azure Wish stuff, and it's his fault. Those two were Europa Universalis over there, which of course the computer game is off of, and my spider web is attached to, and La Grande Guerre. And both of these absorbed so much of my time. Both were incredibly flawed games, still are, but with this grand scope. This one's a little different, and I knew that from the moment that I was looking at it. But part of my feeling was, hey, someone who's eaten up so much of my gaming time with their designs and has, given me so much pleasure over the years in that, I had to take a chance on it. These aren't set right. Gotta fix them. But the first thing that the first thing that you notice is the components are a little bit more modernized. Not terribly. You still have a map with tiny little spaces, which is one of the issues in Universalis. Is there's not quite enough space for the counters. You'd think that would have been learned, but no, nothing was learned. But you also have a bunch of cards. Cards were difficult to produce back then, and so this is a way to generate some of the significant events rather than in the Europa Universalis model of roll on charts and look things up. It has its limiting effects though, because most of the cards don't have too much further explanation, and they're covered in this, which is, not like the event book in Universalis. And then La Grande Guerre had a bunch of event chits in it. Well, you can't teach a new dog old tricks or something like that. Well, what happened was there are events embedded in these pillage markers as well, which is why that is absolutely necessary, because some of the events you have to be able to look up in there. Some of them, I assume, also have additional information in them beyond what the card can provide. Let's take a look. Okay. So the other thing, though, that I noticed from the beginning of this was this is more of a Britannia-style game than anything else. It's not... It didn't seem to promise that, grand scope and detail that both EU and La Grande Guerre provide. However, Azure Wish did a Britannia game. It's Hispania over there. It's a muddled mess with some really interesting ideas in it. But again, it is an exceedingly flawed game that for some reason got, very high... It became very valuable in terms of for the collector market or whatever. And some of the AWE games are not that value. Some of them are incredibly rare and very hard to find. That game was the most overblown version of Britannia that I thought you could have. Italia was kind of a drawing back and put things kind of in the middle, polish up that Hispania style of game, but at least with the D10s for combat resolution instead of D6s, among other things. But in either case, they both kind of and especially Hispania, strayed away from what was kind of a clean design for Britannia. Britannia has its issues. Like, you have to be constantly looking up on your victory point cards, and you have those here, your nation cards, to figure out what you need to do and when. And that can be kind of tedious. If you play Britannia a lot, you get used to it. If you start playing a lot of Britannia clones, it becomes a lot harder because you probably don't play them the way that the people who are really into Britannia get used to it, right? Maybe somebody finds one and they say, "Wow, this one is just the best," like Italia, for example, and get used to that and whatever. Okay, so this is kind of like that, but as you can see, the board handles is a lot more complicated. It's not just these nice big areas, maybe with some value on them for how many units can stack in it or whatever. Instead, it's got an economic value on the spaces, as if this was, an EU type game. It's got city values in it. Again, it's beginning to sound more like somewhere between EU and Britannia as you start going. It's covering a period of time, I already mentioned that's covered in scenarios inside of Imperium Romanum, which I have over there in that set. Imperium Romanum has always been kind of, well, one of the factors that always depressed me about Imperium Romanum was you couldn't play out that whole experience of, the establishment and decline of the Roman Empire, which the game covers all of it and a little bit before, a little bit of Republican stuff, but not much. But, and it gives you some of these same barbarian states and everything, but this is working more on the migrations of these barbarian tribes in a more complex but somewhat similar fashion to Britannia. Trying to think something. Oh yeah, one other game I wanted to mention a bit of a call out to is Empires of the Middle Ages. So this kind of provides also sort of the stepping stone between that falling part of the Roman Empire, and Rome exists in this to begin with. I mean, this is Rome. It's not in its height, at its absolute height, but 350 is when the bad stuff is starting to really happen, right? This is where the decline, doesn't stop for the most part. You're starting with Julian on the throne, so the empire's Christian, even if he's not. Part of me kind of thinks, I'm really interested in the ideas of this in some ways, but a little worried about that Britannia side. So what I did was, because after reading the rules, I said, I don't know how this is going to play. I played through almost 2 full turns of it. And after the first turn, I was frustrated after trying to set it up, I was frustrated as hell. I found the errata online. That doesn't help too much. The rulebook is a fucking mess, as is to be expected, given the designer. There is a huge amount of errata. Some of it, massive rewrites of rules and everything are needed. And unfortunately, if you know me, I don't know why the hell you'd be watching this, except maybe, you're like maybe you're a Thibaut fan, in which case you probably should be watching, because we probably have some overlap, if you can stand me. Unfortunately, this is a glossy rule book. His other rule books that I've had have all been on these AWE productions, which, for the French version as well, but for the English version, are basically produced as photocopies, as far as I can tell, and folded with a staple in the middle of them. They're really, really crappy print jobs, but they're on paper that you can write on with a pencil. This is barely writable with a pencil. It's better than some glossy, but I can't see where there's errata written in. I've penciled it in. It is very, very difficult. So here's some. I've scratched stuff out and written something here. It's barely readable. You can't get it. My options are basically to mark it up with a Sharpie. And I've brought this up every time when fucking glossy paper comes into play. I mark it up with a Sharpie, and then if the errata changes or I change my mind about something and decide to write, to make my own rules or whatever, I have messed up the original rule book completely, so it's not recoverable. I'm not sure the pencil's erasable off this shit. But yeah, I hate glossy rule books. Obviously, people who can cope with living rules, hey, more power to you. Not that they exist for this yet. Maybe they never will. Okay, let's look at the components and talk a little bit about what you've got. First of all, you get the map. I've alluded a little bit to it. You have multiple different terrain types. They have a value which is their economic value in red of the different provinces. Provinces are established in areas. Well, how do you determine areas? It would be really nice if those were the colors instead of the terrain types. They're not. Instead, there's borders, and they're very, very faint. Okay, this is pretty clear. Finding the border between, as to what the exact shape of Oriens is, especially with counters on the map, almost impossible. Again, a big step back in the graphical representation from the admittedly pixelated, horrible maps that Azure Wish was putting out. But, this is pretty. But man, I have a really hard time identifying what's on it. Similar also to the Azure Wish stuff, some of the counters contain information that's difficult to read. At least I'm not clipping, it's all on the counter, but in some cases I'm finding myself having to really squint to find things. And likewise, the tiny print on these, again, there's this, let's fit lots and lots of information onto things. Now, these are kind of a shame. They could have been double printed, but nah, they're all black on the other side. Okay, so that's your map situation, and you've got a key, luckily right on the map, that gives you some information on here. And so these two numbers are how much that whole area, the Oriens area, which is traced somewhere. I think it goes up here. Looks like it goes up here. Yeah, it cuts over here and comes down there. So that region has a total value of 8 points for the kingdoms, which is actually the sum of all the province points, or 9 points for an empire, which is kind of a lie. It's the sum of all the city points in it. But those only apply if you control the entire area. Okay. You have the different terrain types noted here. You have two different types of cities, fortified and unfortified. For whatever reason, the game says to set up all the forts on the fortified cities. I don't think it's necessary, but it does help call them out a little bit, so I continue to do that. You also have empty cities. Those are places where a city could be founded someday. And so far, I've seen the option to do that once, but did not take it. But also when these barbarian groups settle down into an area and turn into a kingdom, they end up they end up founding a city as their new capital. You have these capital markers, which are a little bit different. You have the actual military units, which some of them are backsided because they have they can take a hit. This is an elite unit, so it can take a hit. The limes are backsided with infantry units that they become after a certain point in the game. Basically, they're all going to be destroyed for the most part, but some of them will be disbanded, and I hope that's not the fire coming close. No, that's the train. I'm terrified of the fires right now. Let's see what else that we want to touch on here. Anything from the map key We have a number of different little charts and tables. These are reproduced elsewhere, sometimes on the map in different places. I don't know that they are necessarily the most useful things to be on the board, but they're among the most useful things, and other things might be too large, like the combat system as a whole would be a very useful thing to have on a card or something, and I don't believe it is. All right. You have some informational markers. So, for example, there's heresy here. This is in decline. That's a status, but basically the Western Roman Empire is already in a state of collapsing. You have age. I know these are here. I think this is here, but again, I haven't gotten all these to the right place. Age is an important concept. Let's hold off for a while. You have a treasury track, and those are all wrong, but it's the amount of cash that the different nations have. For the barbarian nations, it's essentially unimportant until they become a kingdom, although somebody can steal their money, but they just hoard it. For the civilized nations, which is an important distinction, there are barbarians and there are two types of civilized nations, kingdoms and empires. At the beginning of the game, Rome exists as two different empires, the Byzantines and the Western Romans. Although they're both controlled by the same player, no, the color side. When this game was produced, a whole bunch of stuff was advertised, whatever. It was a Kickstarter project. One of the things was, hey, a scenario book that's going to involve all kinds of different to handle things other than the base scenario. So there's like, a one-turn scenario or something like that, which apparently is horrible from somebody who has spoken about it. But, it's just meant to get you into the game and get you playing. That's what I kind of did on my own. But each nation has its own kind of lifespan, like they do in Britannia, and there may be periods, and it looks to me like Pink can make a lot of points off their Romans early in the game, but those Romans are going to die off, and their other nations aren't going to make as many points, I hope. And this could be horribly unbalanced like Hispania is, in which case, well, that just sucks, because that game just had, either I didn't understand something, or it has the Visigoths as being a total waste, because they just cannot survive. Anytime I play, at least. But anyway, so the balancing of these different nations, etc., there's nothing in place to handle that. It's like Britannia. You're dealt a set of countries, and you're going to be playing them throughout, whatever that set is. And they may have different, periods during which they make more points. There's sort of an attempt to make sure that everybody is probably, I assume, I haven't looked too carefully, but I guess there's some sort of attempt to make sure everybody's kind of playing at all points in the game, although I gotta tell you, on the first turn, green and blue don't have a whole hell of a lot they're doing. And where are my Ostrogoths and Visigoths? They should be on the board already. Okay. Oh no, they invade this turn or something. I don't know. I'll look it up. I thought I had everything set up. Jesus. I don't see them there. I thought they came in on turn 1. Yeah, they come in on turn 1. I don't know why they don't set up on turn 1. Don't know. Okay. So, yeah, there's really no distinction between those two things as far as I can tell. What else do we have that we want to talk about? Some of these nations aren't really controlled by anyone. So, like these, the Romans technically run them, but they're not going to generate any points. And they may be referenced here. There are tiny nations that don't deserve their own cards. No, none of those have these. These guys, I don't think are all the right color. So the Hiberni are not owned by the Persians. They don't generate points for the Persians. But these are minor countries that can do stuff. And similarly, these as well. So there's basically the color kind of shows where the alignment is. So for example, the Armenians are a client state of the Romans, but they don't have to stay that way. But these guys aren't even mentioned. They're just really pickings for some other players. They are barbarian hordes that you can wipe out and get points for. I want to take a moment because I was talking about, hey, there was this scenario book that was supposed to be out. Well, at least according to the designer, it never shipped from China. And no effort was made to get that into anybody's hands. So something that was, one of the rewards or whatever for the Kickstarter. I don't remember if you paid for it separately. I certainly wasn't interested in buying it separately, but it may have just been a throw-in thing. But now it's just an online thing because there was no way to force the Chinese to send it or something. What was available were a couple of expansions, and I don't think I got all of them. The scenario book may have been the one I didn't order, and now I've got it available to me for free. I don't know. But we've got the Before the Invasions, which is something that produces 4 pre-turns to the game, covering from 250 onward. My initial intention was to play with both of the expansions, the other one being Into the East, which generates another whole board of things and new nations and everything. But honestly, after having played a couple of turns of this, I have decided I am just going to play this for this time and maybe go into one of the others. The 2 expansions cannot be played together. You can't, and I'm not sure why. It may be a balance thing, in which case I don't really care. I'm not really sure that I have any faith that this game is going to be any more balanced than Hispania is. Given Europa Universalis as a track record for something of this kind of nature, I would say it probably isn't. La Grande Guerre might be, who knows. I've played it many times. It has never ended up in a Central Powers victory, but there's enough randomness in the way the war can end that it may not be too unbalanced. Europa Universalis, on the other hand, is fundamentally flawed. There are powers that have no chance of winning the game. And I suspect, given what I saw with Hispania and given what I've seen in Europa Universalis, I have no expectations for this to be a balanced game, no matter how you play it. But anyway, you have these 2 expansions, one of which allows you to play during the strength of the Roman Empire, which kind of doesn't interest me as much. You might see maybe Germanic migrations, the early Germanic migrations or something. I don't know. It seems like it's too late for that. The Franks and the Alemanni are already in Germany long before that, so I don't know. And it's too early, or it's also too late, to handle the Gallic expansions and all that. All kind of stuff that would be interesting in a prequel. I'm not so terribly interested in what this might reveal unless it's handling the stuff that Imperium Romanum does best, which is Roman versus Roman conflicts. And so I didn't even really pay too much attention to it. I skimmed it. The Into the East is a little more interesting. It adds Persia. It pushes Persia over further east, giving you the rest of Persia, and then has India in it and whatnot. And there's interesting stuff going over there, but I want to focus on as little as possible at this point because the game is painful already. And I haven't even gotten to the rule book, right? Okay. So yeah, I was at the concept of age. So what happens is every turn, for the most part, each country ages. The barbarians work their way up and can eventually become a kingdom. And at one point or another, they must try to become, or they have an automatic possibility of becoming a kingdom. And they just follow their own little path, and eventually they may have to settle down, or you may desire to settle them down so that you start making more victory points off them. And you'll see that with the individual cards as we're playing, I think, those choices. Although I haven't gotten to that point yet, so I don't know. Once you become a civilized nation, though, you're on a clock. Every turn you move forward, and I don't remember what this is. I think this is a chance of going into decline, but I'm not absolutely certain about that. But it's something bad. And so various event cards and administrative cards can, and maybe other things, can throw you into a situation where you end up gaining additional age. Now, it's also possible you might lose some age, but for the most part, you count on it being one or more years, one or more turns, one or more points on the age chart for every turn that you play. With this being kind of a doom zone, and we'll see how that works with the rules. Because again, I'm not really too familiar with it. I haven't played to that point in the game, but I've watched the Western Romans start looking like they were in a lot of trouble, even in just 2 turns. I think that's most of the stuff for the map. Here I've just got on the turn track little markers that are raider markers, basically, and not only, here is an age marker, for example, for someone who doesn't have, who comes in as a kingdom or whatever, but basically, this is just a reminder of who's coming in at any given time. I can't just put a whole stack of units like you could in Britannia usually or something. Actually, with Britannia, I usually just put the population marker on the board, on the turn track. So it's kind of just a reminder of what's coming in and what I need to pay attention to, although so far I've had to refer to the appendices for that. Okay, you have the big rule book. You have the set of appendices, which includes most of the information on other player aids. It includes this timetable, though, which I think is the only place where we have a list of everything that happens each turn. And this is basically the reinforcements, the leader changes, stuff like that. Calamities and events is covered in here. These are both kind of random event type things. And then each nation has its own little booklet, and these kind of cover those. And then the information on the victory points is also inserted in those per nation. We have some important tables here that are reproduced from the rule book. Here's something. So, I'm trying to remember the game that had this. Ooh. I think it's Europa Universalis has the fast battle system. This game has the same kind of thing. And I am not going to bother with that at all. It's basically use dice to generate. You use dice to generate with bonuses and stuff to generate combat results. Whereas there's all these custom dice that come with the game. And it feels like the core system is designed around the custom dice. So even though they call it the advanced system, I don't see it as that important. Again, you have each of the major players has their own little booklet. The Romans have 2. With the information covering their major nation. So the Huns are the major green nation. But then all the nations that they're going to control are replaced in here. And this gives their victory point chart, not much else. And then maybe some other information on the back. The Byzantines, lots of special rules for each nation. And then this has the turn record on it, the timetable on it in addition. The Romans have all their victory points on here. And again, each nation has a couple pages of special rules that apply to them. You got the Persians, who are the yellow player, and the Goths, who are the blue player, who are, of course, both the types of Goths. And then each of these is a bunch of other things. It's not a summary of information that's on these cards. It's nothing that useful. It's more like the Hispanian style where, hey, let's throw a bunch of special rules of how these things convert from one type of nation to another, you know. And here it's the barbarian to kingdom to empire, whatever. Not many are going to turn into empires. Like, if you can kind of think about it, you know, what was the Gothic Empire? No, the Visigoths go to Spain and they become the Spanish kingdom. But there is the opportunity, if they get big enough, that they become something else, an empire. Anything else? We got a little score sheet here. Tons and tons of counters for all the nationalities. And take a peek at the different kinds of cards. The event cards look like this. They're divided into two colors. The dark brown are, if you draw one of them, you have to play it immediately. The other ones are kind of hold cards. These are a set of things that come in 3 different flavors, and don't worry about the coloring. That's the different flavors. They're clear from that. And you have this little mechanism by which you choose one. You deal off a bunch of these and you choose one of those cards to pay for, and then you suffer the bad effects of having bought that card. And then diplomacy cards, which are sort of like event cards. These are all hold cards for the most part. And again, some of these are different colored. Not sure what's about that. Just, I don't know. Their arts people decided it would be helpful to have different colors for different things. And you can see there's a lot of information on each of these. These aren't like little I don't know. There's more information in them than in most CDGs. All right. In addition to the nations here, we have a bunch of nations that are not yet in play. Okay. Let me take a little bit of a break, swap batteries, drink a little water, and start into the rolls. I think we're going to go into huge detail on these rolls. Okay. You have different types for the units in the game, and that's mainly for setup. We'll worry about it as it happens. There's certain special modifiers to the units that you'll see on here, and I should have gone over this. So this is like an elite unit. This is a heavy unit. They're both. Elite units can be flipped over, and they generally become regular. This is an archer with mountain capabilities. This is a horse archer, and you can kind of see, hey, wow, there's a lot of different information on some of these counters. Yeah. That is of importance. Let's skip down. Okay, leaders. Leaders have 5 numbers on them, plus a turn of entry. And some units have a turn of entry, and they're not available in your force pool until they come about. The first number is combat bonus. This is going to affect a lot of things. It gives you rerolls in combat. It gives you capability to intercept or flee. Those are the main ones I've seen. This is your stacking bonus. You have a stacking limit of 4 in most areas in the game. Mountains, the brown areas, are the exception. They only have a stacking limit of 3. I don't think deserts have any limitation, which is kind of weird, but they're not very valuable, so I don't know why you'd be fighting battles in them. So that gives you additional units on top of that, and that's a huge bonus. I don't know. I'll leave it alone. The administrative bonus, this is for the ruler of your country. It's going to determine getting extra ones of these cards. the diplomatic bonus, extra diplomatic cards, and the campaign value. If you recall, yeah, I don't have a good answer to this. So in the Britannia system, usually leaders are able to move further than other units. Here, this is represented in a different way. They're allowed to do additional things. So you're going to move all your units, fight your battles, and then each of your leaders who has a campaign bonus, and most of them do, can take another action. And they can call units around them and do this, and it's all handled in a very light sort of way. Barbarians have these horde things. This is sort of their homeland until they become a kingdom, at which point they turn into a city, in a city location. These are semi-mobile, but they have limitations on them, and that's where your troops show up and such not. Okay. We've talked about the map to a large extent there. A limited version of the sequence of play here. Winning the game is basically however many victory points you get. And however Islam is created, it might end the game a turn early. And I don't know who that advantage is. Okay. So, like I said, there's three types of nation in this: barbarians, kingdoms, and empires. Kingdoms and empires are considered civilized. Something else on the map that I didn't mention. This is a barbarian area. This is a civilized area. Okay, and those two have some distinctions that we can come into, but it doesn't, a civilized kingdom can be formed in a barbarian area. May not be wise. Yeah. Okay. There are three types of spaces for the empire, for the civilized track: young, mature, and old. There's no indication of young on here. It is going to impact your capability to keep money throughout the game. That's the only thing I can think of for the difference between young and mature. I think there's something else for old. Some nations are inactive, like those green barbarians up there. They don't really do anything. They don't attack, they don't age, they don't track treasuries, they don't get victory points, but they can turn into a client. Okay. There are raider nations, for example, the Berbers here, who aren't really on the board for the most part. However, they can end up succeeding in coming onto the board, and then they become an inactive nation, and you stop getting victory points for them, which is kind of a weird thing. Maybe kind of a limit on their victory points, but I don't know about that. But they also stop becoming raiders after some point. Some, like the Angles and Saxons, become a normal nation in the course of the game. They stop being raiders, and they start becoming either a kingdom, maybe a barbarian, but I don't know. Okay, so barbarians can turn into a kingdom once they hit age 3, and that's noted with this question mark. And once they turn to age 5, they may automatically turn into a kingdom. If they age from their last space, they make another check to become a kingdom at that point. For civilized nations, the kingdoms might become empires when they own 3 areas of the board. That's pretty big, okay? Like Hispania is an area, so the Spanish kingdom would have to take over all of France, both the Gallic areas, in addition to holding on to Hispania. to become an empire, or it could take Mauritania and Southern Gaul or whatever, you know. But you have to be pretty big to become an empire. And every kingdom is checked whenever it advances a space on the track. Civilized nations eventually can end up in decline, at which point they'll produce less income. Anytime a civilized nation tries to drop off the end of the board, it takes an extra level of decline, and there's 2 levels of decline. If a nation rejuvenates while in decline, its decline decreases. If a level of decline is already doubled, then a kingdom is forced to transition to empire. Here we have something. Yeah, if they can. The empire marker has to pay more money, and they have to pay their in decline penalty yet again. Now, that can force a bankruptcy, and a bankruptcy can cause an empire to fall. Barbarians active. Okay, so the next thing, well, heresies age. We got a couple of heresies on the map. These affect a whole an area, not just a single province. So this is affecting all of Africa, which, again, we have to look and see. It's pretty hard to see, you know. Mauritania, I think, is down here, and Africa is along the coast. Yeah. Okay. So the heresy is on the African area, and Britannia also has a heresy. Those just slowly decline and stop being heresies eventually. They basically last 2 turns. Okay. So then the nations get to do their stuff. And first, all the barbarians activate one at a time. And that's done in increasing order of age, I think. Here. Decreasing age. So you start with the oldest, work your way back. And, yeah, I think I did that right. Yeah. And then within that, they have a number, and the earlier the number, the older it is, if that's a tiebreaker. And kingdoms and empires work the same way in terms of then you move to the kingdoms after you do the barbarians, and then you move to the empires in the same kind of ordering. Barbarians can gain money, but they're not allowed to use it. On the turn they appear, they usually get an invasion, which basically allows them to move all their units twice. And it also allows their horde to move without doing a special migration. Barbarians have different types of units on the board, but any of their elite units are flipped to their backside until they stop being barbarians. They can't have elites. They can have heavies and they can have cav. Barbarians are generally going to be spending the game trying to find their home area. They can generate some points, but for the most part, they're just migrating around the board, which feels a little dissatisfying to me. But it's appropriate. They usually didn't want to attack. They just wanted to find a place to settle, and it was Rome that's saying, no, you can't come through our limites. Okay, nomad is a special type of barbarian. Now, this is tricky. I can't find a real definition of the nomad. They give this horse archer. I think it's nomads, it's barbarians that have a lot of horse archers. How I'm going to define that in specific? Here we go. Alans, Avars, Hephthalites, Huns, Khazars, and Kushans are nomads. Interesting. The Kushans are not on the board ever. They might deploy to the board, but they're a raider nation. So they have the ability to pick their reinforcements themselves. They're allowed to enter Scythia. They're not allowed to use boats. They have a bonus in steeps, but a disadvantage for besieging. And the biggie is that other barbarians can force them to submit fairly easily, but then they actually have the option to rebel. However, rebelling is expensive to them. They could lose a lot of victory points. Okay. And their vassals are more likely to rebel. Okay. Most of the civilized nations end up being kingdoms. A kingdom is going to have a capital of its own. It does an administration. It gets its own income, and it pays maintenance for its units. Basically, each unit it has on the board, it has to pay $1 for, which comes out of its treasury gains. Therefore, it can go bankrupt. It also has to purchase units, and because it uses administrative cards, they have some special effects. They can make it so that your main leader doesn't exist for the turn. Just, again, all this chrome in here. Empires work similarly to the kingdoms, except they don't pay maintenance and they get different income. They just have a different system. And Rome and Byzantium are united under the Roman Empire. They split into separate entities on turn 3. The basic thing about them being the same is that they're allowed to coordinate their forces together. They administer differently, but they move their forces at the same time, and that's a big deal. There are some weird things about it, though. So, like on turn 1, Julian is over here, and I'm not sure how you get him to the east. But historically, he went and fought over in the east. Does he have a lot of campaigns? Yeah, he has a fair number, so he could actually ship over there. And that would make it plausible, but expensive. On the other hand, Persia is probably worth more than diddling around with the Germans, which is what I did. Okay, the Huns. Okay, so this is interesting. One of these players' main nation is the Huns. They come onto the board, and you can do things to impact this, but they basically randomly either dissolve or turn into a kingdom. No, to an empire. So the Huns, it could be worth a huge amount of points or almost none to the player who has them. And I don't know how that can possibly be balanced. They're the main power of the green player, and it really is a crapshoot whether or not you get those points. And this feels kind of like the Visigoths thing, except the Visigoths I don't think can possibly survive in Hispania. Okay, how do you transition to a kingdom? In general, other than the Huns, once you reach age 3, you announce that you want to become a kingdom. And you don't have to make a check. Once you reach age 5, you have to start rolling on this little table, and if you get less than or equal to your age, you're forced into becoming a kingdom. Okay, when you become a kingdom, you now become civilized. You have an age of 1. You get a pile of money. You must settle in a city space. And if you're not able to settle in a city space, you don't have anything under control, you kick around until you kind of try to find one, and then that's weird. When you become a kingdom, you can choose to stop being pagan or Aryan, I think, and transition to Christian, or you could transition from pagan to Aryan if you want. And at that point, you become civilized, and you start following the civilized economic rules. You have better units available to you. Kingdoms can become empires once they are 3 full areas. However, barbarian areas only count as half. You have to make a die roll to transition, and you have to trick it as soon as you start qualifying. And becoming in decline makes it more likely that you're going to become an empire. And that's a good thing, because being in decline means you're going to collapse if you don't become an empire. And then you start with a new age of 1, unless you're Persians, who have their own special rules, of course. And you get some cash. Okay. The timetable lists reinforcements that some nations get, and sometimes it's reinforcements to your force pool. Barbarians generally get them to their horde, civilized countries to their force pool. You get specific named leaders, perhaps. If you don't get a named leader, you might get an unnamed leader. Rome, both halves of Rome have a Caesar, who is just basically the general. They also have their emperor, who is named. If you remember, this is after Diocletian, so you have 2 Augusti and 2 Caesar. With the Caesar presumably being promoted, but not always. Not usually. Okay. So barbarians are going to just get what they're told that they'll get. And they tell you specific types, and you kind of randomize, if I recall correctly. Nomads, on the other hand, get to choose their total types of units that they get. Kingdoms and empires get to buy units out of their current force pool. Federales will have to lend units to their federator, I guess. If a nation has disappeared, has no units of its own on the map, one of its units controlled by another nation as an auxiliary or mercenary is removed from each nation. Okay. I'm not sure how you get disappeared. I don't think you can wipe barbarians out, because they just keep submitting, which might be okay. You wouldn't want to be able to wipe out a barbarian before it becomes a kingdom. And then these things, there was crap wandering around up there for a long time that existed while these swept through. So, and those things aren't going to generate any points, so they're no big deal. So something has to become a kingdom or an empire to disappear, and then it has to collapse, basically. It doesn't look like there's a way of making something vaporize. I may be mistaken about that. Okay, events. Each of the 4 players gets 1 event card per turn. And also there are events baked into these. Some of the events in there are public, some are private. These, most of them are private. And let's just mix things in here. Some of them, there's this event section, but just because we want to make the rules as unintuitive and unreasonably organized as possible, we're going to put barbarian raiders under event. They have nothing to do with events. The next section's where they're actually explained. And let's put something else in there. This is close to events. At the beginning, during each turn, you roll a die to see which caravan gets bonused. There are 4 caravans on the board. They each basically produce 1 buck for the country that owns them. If there are raiders, present, barbarians present in them, they might get captured instead. But one of them gets bonus and is worth 5. It's just much more valuable commodities coming from that direction. It's possible that an event card can up that to a 10, and up the other ones to higher as well. Worry about that as it happens. So it's kind of somewhat related to barbarians, and then to events, and then barbarians are mentioned in here. So it's kind of similar to raids. I don't know. So there's two kinds of things that can raid for the most part. There's raider nations, which are these things like the Barbary. And what happens with them is they don't get placed on the board. They come from Numidia, and they can raid an adjacent space, and they'll use this raider process. Another option is barbarians can choose to raid during their activation. But they're not allowed to do much else. They can shift forces within their controlled provinces before they do a raid. And then they have to commit 2 units. The raider nations are basically committing 2 units to the raid as well. Okay, the way the raid works is you pick a civilized province with an empty city site on it, and you don't do this. It's crossed out in pencil, even though you can't see it. You roll on a chart, and something happens. And in general, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get this marker on there as high as possible. Minus, plus. It's like an EU. Thibault has this, hey, let's use plus minus for everything, and plus is stronger, minus is weaker. So revolts use the same thing, heresies use the same thing. Okay. You're trying to do that because that'll be a bonus on your table for other turns. And if you get in the good space, the 7 to 10 space, you get 3 victory points, and the raid plus marker goes. The danger is, if you get to the 11 to 12 space, your raiders get placed on the board, and you might get kind of no longer be raiders. So you probably don't want to just keep raiding the same place, but on the other hand, the plus gives you a bonus and makes it more likely you'll get those 3 victory points. And some of the countries stop raiding no matter what and just go away. So I just try to make it as good as I can. In addition to the raid, you get a pillage marker, which is drawn randomly, and the raider collects that money. That could trigger an event. And then the location that it was raided gets a pillage marker on it, and then there's some penciling out to get rid of this. There's an automatic process that gets rid of the pillage markers. They just slowly disappear. Raiders that have elected to settle have to fight any enemies that are in the province, and then they become inactive, and unless the timetable says wake them up, like with the Saxons or something, they're just going to sit there. Okay. If you settle barbarians, that's no big deal. They're still in the game. They've just pushed into that area and decided to live there. Okay. Now, the idea of who controls what province and what area. Since we have 3 different types of kingdoms in the game, 3 different types of nations in the game, let's make up 3 different rule sets for this. This is so Thibault. And no, EU does not have these problems, but Le Grand Guerre kind of does have this kind of stuff. Okay. Provinces are in areas. A barbarian area has an axe, a civilized area has an icon. We talked about that. You get victory points for control of provinces and areas, and it can influence the income of kingdoms and empires. A nation controls the provinces and areas controlled by its vassals. A federator controls the fetus provinces of its federates, but not other provinces that these control by themselves. We're going to come to an issue with markers and representing and indicating what the map state is. It becomes problematic from what I can see. Control can be shared between allies. Okay, a nation controls a province if it has unopposed unit. Now, a province is 1 space on the board. Okay. A single unit is enough for a civilized province. A barbarian province is 2 units or a unit and its horde for the barbarians, or 3 units for a civilized state, some of which can be federales, some of which could be vassals under, whatever. A nation controls an empty province in the areas it controls. So if it takes control of an entire area, it no longer needs to control the provinces. This gets complicated, though, because you control an area by controlling provinces. In order to conquer an enemy province, you have to have successfully besieged the city that's there once you got rid of the troops there. If the city doesn't fall to a siege, the attacker has to leave at the end of the combat step or at the end of the leader's campaigns. And again, there's some fuzziness about how this works. I'm interpreting the words to some extent. Okay, barbarians, kingdoms, and empires can simultaneously claim... Uh-oh, I got something written here I can't read. Civilized don't lose control. Okay. Can simultaneously... Yeah, that's an important one. Claim control of an area. The empire claim overrides the kingdom, which overrides the barbarian. But let's do them in the opposite order. Allies will combine their holdings to determine area control. Each of the allies shares in the area control, which is a big deal because if you have allies, you could actually end up sharing victory points over an area. But that's an unstable situation. Alliances only last like a turn. And you can't just create them at will. Barbarians control an area if the only hordes present are theirs, their allies, or their vassals. Okay? So, let's see. Balticum is this area up here, and that is controlled by this horde. There's a horde here. Okay? Even though there's another nation in here, and I don't know if this setup is right, It's not what the rules say. The rules are wrong, and the errata gives something, and I didn't feel like figuring that all out. It's pretty unimportant. Okay, but then we come down here, and this is Barbarium, which I think, but I can't be certain, is this line. I don't see any coloring here, but obviously there has to be a division there. Comes down here and maybe up here, but maybe not. We're definitely in Germania there, so I think this cuts up here and then over. Okay, and there's 2 hordes here, so unless they're allied, neither one controls it. Okay, that's how barbarians control an area, but remember, that's trumped by kingdoms or empires. Okay. Barbarians control a civilized area, though, if they control the majority of its provinces. I'm not sure what the distinction between these two is, so barbarians control an area, barbarian or civilized, if the only hordes present are theirs, their allies, or their vassals. They control a civilized area if they control the majority. I think that's either one works. And there's reasons for that, guess, because when I started playing, the Huns seem to want to control more than one area, and there's no way you can do that if it was both are a requirement. So I'm assuming they control in either of these cases, and that also linguistically looks, or semantically looks more reasonable. Kingdoms control an area if they control the majority of provinces. Okay, well, controlling the majority of provinces means that you have troops in the majority of provinces, but you control the provinces that you don't have troops. And then we look and say, that's interesting. I mean, let's not look at that one. Let's look over here or something. I'm not sure if I have the majority of provinces here, but you'd kind of think that's Persians. And that's where one of the errata comes in, which is civilized countries, once they control an area, control it until that control has been taken away from them. Okay. And you really have to, trying to understand these rules, even with the errata in place, it's like you're trying to unravel this ball of string. Okay, empires control an area if they control the majority of its cities. This is similar to controlling the majority of provinces, except there's less of them in an area. So, you could be looking at an area like Africa, which has 2 cities and is quite large. If an empire, as is the case here, controls these 2 cities, they trump a kingdom that say controls all the other provinces there. And yeah. Okay. Now, they have total control of an area if they control all of the area's cities and there are no hostile provinces in the area. That's a big deal because that doubles their income for the area. Remember, their income is kind of lower. Okay. Each empty province inside an area is automatically controlled if you control the area. And for an empire, control of an area generates income. Total control improves this income. For a kingdom, it's per province, and controlling the area doesn't help you. Okay. A couple more definitions. I need to swap my battery out, and then we'll load this part of the rules up. And yeah, I'm trying to make it not extensive, not too many hours, but enjoy the ride, Anyways, these core concepts are really kind of the hardest things in the game because they're really kind of twisty. Okay. Friendly, neutral, and hostile. These are different from control. Friendly nations are allowed to stack together. Neutral nations allow free passage but won't stack, and hostile nations can attack each other. Nations are mutually friendly if they are allies or one is federated. And there's some transitive property in there. Nations are neutral if one's a client or vassal of the other one or one of its allies. Vassals and clients of a nation and its allies are mutually neutral. Within a barbarian area, unallied barbarian nations and their vassals are mutually neutral by default. When one activates, the others may declare that they're hostile, though, and this lasts for an entire turn. So this is kind of interesting. It sounds like, and I know this isn't the case, the activating barbarian cannot take aggressive action against the inactive barbarian, the way that's worded. I don't think that's what's intended, again, because of the Huns, who have a goal to basically slaughter lots of Visigoths and Ostrogoths. And the Visigoths and Ostrogoths can get some points by beating up on these things. And I think the active player can also declare themselves hostile, if they so wish. I don't know. All other nations are mutually hostile. A city is friendly if its province is friendly. A province is friendly to a nation's unit if it's controlled by that nation or occupied without opposition by that nation or a friendly nation. Province is neutral to a nation's unit if it is controlled by a neutral nation or whatever. Others will be hostile. This includes provinces with unresolved battles or sieges. I think an empty nation. Yeah. Provinces that are in revolt, however, are considered hostile. We're not going to pay too much attention to this rule because I think it's poorly designed and I did not see any errata on it. I don't think it completely makes sense, but my guess is that a little bit of common sense can work their way through it. Okay, so we have a decent amount of rules left. We have the whole economic system of the administration. We have the movement and combat left, including reaction. We have the advanced combat, which we're not going to touch. That's this. And then sea movement is its own little specialty. And then we have some of the diplomatic aspects that have their own rules there. Just to give you a look forward. And then when we actually start looking at the game, we'll start looking at individual nations and their special rules as needed. I expect the second half of the rules to take us another hour, and then maybe I'll get started tomorrow. Okay, let's send this up.